All right, welcome everybody to the community listening session. Tammy, do you want to bring up the presentation? Okay, we'll go to the next slide. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. My name is Libby Baki, working with the LCD on community outreach. I'm going to go over a few instructions to start. Tammy, next slide. So this session is being recorded. Your microphones are muted, but there's a couple of ways that you can engage during the presentation. One is you can raise your hand virtually, and the other one is through chat. There's also, we have closed captioning option available. It's on your menu. We'll be doing some polling. We had planned to do some breakout rooms, but there might be, because I think there's 8 of you that have joined us tonight, we might be able to do a smaller group discussion, which will be great. So to do chat on the menu bar, you will see below you, as sometimes it's above you, there's a box that says chat. You click on that. Down below, you can type your message and it will go out to everybody. And I want to say that anything that you put in the chat, if you have a comment or a question, all of that will be recorded. All of your comments in chat will be collected and will be part of our summary for tonight's meeting. The next slide. To raise your hand, you click on a button that says reaction. There's some choices. The raise your hand option is below. Next slide. Tonight, we will do a welcome and a land acknowledgement, a very short polling exercise. Sadie's going to give us a project overview. We'll spend some time on the overview of the recommendations. Here we'll have a breakout room, but I think we'll stay together as a group, have a group discussion, and then next steps. The next slide. And with that, I'm turning it over to you, Susan.
Great. Thank you, Libby. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Millhauser, and I'm a natural hazards planner focused on wildfire with the Department of Land Conservation and Development and the staff lead for the Wildfire Adapted Communities Project. And we want to thank you all very much for joining us this evening. We're really glad to have you here to share your unique views and feedback on the department's draft wildfire adapted communities recommendations. And as noted in the chat, if you want to take a moment to introduce yourself by putting your name and affiliation in the chat, that would be great. I want to take a moment to introduce Commissioner Stuart Warren, who will be saying a few words and then of welcome, and then following Commissioner Warren, Sadie Carney will be sharing a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Susan, and good evening, everyone. My name is Stuart Warren. I'm a Land Conservation Development Commissioner and the liaison for the Commission to this body of work. Today marks the 2-year anniversary of the 2020 Labor Day fires. And as someone who lived through the Alameda fire, today's been a very challenging day for me, and I'm sure many others. September 8, 2020 was a day that changed many Oregonians' lives forever, and many of us are still rebuilding our homes and our lives. But I think one thing we can all agree on is that we need to adapt our land use system to the ever-changing wildfire landscape in Oregon. We're experiencing more frequent and intense fires and more days with smoke. Although this summer so far has been a pretty nice break from the last 5 years. Recommendations from the department represent countless hours of work and lots of great community input. And I think they represent what I would describe as best practices from a land use and hazard mitigation perspective for wildfire. The question is, which ones work best for Oregonians, and should they be mandatory or voluntary? That's what I'm hoping to hear from you folks today. The Commission will not be taking any formal action on these recommendations. These are recommendations from the department to the legislature. Ultimately, it'll be up to the legislature to decide how we move forward. So your input's really important. So please participate in today's meeting. And my job tonight will be really just to listen and help the DLCD staff carry your message to the commission and ultimately to the legislature next year. Thank you for taking the time to be here, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. And I should also just acknowledge Commissioner Colleen Roberts from Jackson County. Commissioner Roberts, thanks for joining us tonight, and I look forward to hearing more from all of you. Thanks. Now to Sadie Carney.
Thank you, Commissioner Warren. Tricia, we can move to our next slide. And I would like to start our meeting with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the many tribes and bands who call Oregon their ancestral territory and honor the ongoing relationship between the land, plants, animals, and people indigenous to this place we now call Oregon. We recognize the continued sovereignty of the 9 federally recognized tribes who have ties to this place and thank them for continuing to teach us how we might all be here together. Thank you.
All right, Trish, are you ready for some polling?
I am. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so first up, we have what part of Oregon do you live in? Central, Eastern, Portland Metro, Southern Oregon, the Gorge, Willamette Valley, other? If you click other, if you could just tell us where you're coming from, that would help us out. I like to get up to about 80% participation here, so we're slowly climbing. Okay. Looks like we have pretty good distribution. Obviously missing folks from Eastern Oregon. Then the next poll we have for you is, how would you describe where you live? City, rural, small town, unhoused, other? And you can click a couple options here if you feel like more than one applies. Give it one more person. 88. There we go. Okay. All right. So lots of folks coming from rural. And then if you clicked other, if you could just go ahead and put in the chat, that would help us get a better understanding. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Okay,
All right. I think I take back the microphone, right?
back to
And,
you, Sadie.
yeah, we move on to our project overview.
Yep.
All right, so we can go on to the next slide from here. And this slide talks about DLCD's mission. And just to be clear, this is our agency mission overall, not just a mission statement for this work or this project. And that is to help communities and people plan for, protect, and improve the built and natural systems that provide a high quality of life. In partnership with community members like you and local governments, we foster sustainable and vibrant communities and protect our natural resources legacy. Next slide. So Senate Bill 762 is what we're responding to. So our Wildfire Adapted Communities work is in response to this legislation that was passed by the Oregon legislature in 2021. Senate Bill 762 is a comprehensive wildfire preparedness and resiliency bill that takes a proactive approach to help modernize and improve wildfire preparedness through the 3 key strategies that you see on the slides. So I see now that there's 4 check marks there. So these 4 key strategies that you see on this slide. Next slide. The legislation requires action from 11 implementing agencies with the aim of providing long-term security for our state by minimizing loss of life and property, protecting the lives of firefighters, protecting and managing Oregon's forest assets, and creating a more predictable and protected future for communities and development at risk from the impacts of wildfire. Am I on the wrong slide here?
No, I think you should.
Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah.
The Wildfire Programs Director, Doug Graff, in the Governor's Office, and the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council are responsible for coordination and oversight. DLCD's work is closely aligned with the work of Oregon Department of Forestry, who's responsible for the wildfire risk map, the Oregon Office of the State Fire Marshal, responsible for defensible space code updates, and the Department of Consumer and Business Affairs, who are responsible for updates to building codes for home hardening. Other agencies are focused on community risk reduction, public health, air quality, workforce development, and utilities. So I feel like my slides are a little out of order here, so I apologize.
I think the presentation got a little ahead.
Okay, I
Yeah.
apologize, everyone.
No, you're.
I
yeah.
think,
Okay,
let's make sure you're on the same slide now, though.
yes, let us do.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm good. So under section 11 of Senate Bill 762, which is called land use, DLCD is tasked with making recommendations. And our recommendations are for updates to the statewide land use planning program and local comprehensive plans and zoning codes. And these updates would be needed to incorporate the wildfire risk map and minimize wildfire risk. And that's what we think these recommendations do. The recommendations must include appropriate levels of state and local resources necessary for effective implementation, and they may allow for regional differences. And I'll take this moment to mention that we do have a survey that is targeted to our local government partners to help us determine what appropriate levels of state and local resources are. And that we are keeping that open as long as possible for about another week and a half. So if you are one of those local government partners, we would love your feedback on that. I see that the link is in the chat. And then while that survey is open, DLCD is hosting a webinar for local governments, special districts, tribal governments, and others to get your feedback and answer your questions. The webinar will be on September 13th, 2022 from noon until 1 p.m. So please consider joining us if you are available. Okay, next slide. So the recommendations may include, but are not limited to, provisions regarding sufficient defensible space, building codes, safe evacuations, and development considerations in areas of extreme or high wildfire risk. Next slide. Our report, our recommendations report, is due to the legislature and the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council on October 1st of this year. And then the council may either advance refined or additional recommendations on land use to the legislature. And then during the 2023 legislative session, the legislature will consider the entire body of recommendations they have received, and they may act at that time to direct DLCD to undertake additional work. And this could be rulemaking, this could be the development of guidance or model code, and we'll find out. Next slide. So tonight, our listening session is really designed to get input from all of you on how to address wildfire risk in state and local land use planning programs. Your ideas and your feedback, your lived experience, everything that you're bringing this evening will inform our recommendations to the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council and legislature. The listening sessions are part of a larger engagement process through which we've aimed for broad participation and to engage underserved Oregonians. We've had multiple opportunities for involvement, including an online open house and survey, the formation of a stakeholder advisory group, a local government survey, and a Latinx focus group. And we are also in consultation with our tribal governments. And I think this is where I turn it over to Susan for an overview of our recommendations. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sadie. I was just having a coughing fit, so hopefully you can hear me okay. Excuse me. Next slide, please. As there was just a mention in the chat, that we have held multiple listening sessions. We've had a pretty extensive public engagement process to help inform the draft recommendations, including the listening sessions, a community survey, an online open house, and then these follow-up listening sessions and the local government survey, as well as we convened a Wildfire Adapted Communities stakeholder group that met 5 times, and we've had follow-up conversations with stakeholder group members and other organizations and state agencies to really help inform our recommendations. We also conducted research into best practices, including policies currently used by Oregon jurisdictions, 2020 wildfire recovery lessons, and feedback from the Land Conservation and Development Commission. And all of that feedback, including the community engagement, really helped to inform these guiding principles that you can see on the screen. So we're looking at protecting human life. We really want to have recommendations that, when implemented, increase the ability of Oregon communities to withstand and recover from wildfires. There's a strong emphasis and focus on achieving equitable outcomes and community capacity. It's been elevated through our community engagement process, really to protect and increase the resilience of important community assets and infrastructure. Also to protect the natural environment we all depend on and the places where people live, work, and gather. We also are looking at opportunities to work with communities to identify regional and local differences for the recommendations implementation within the context of the statewide land use planning program, and also considering the local capacity and state support needed to implement the wildfire mitigation measures. And to kind of more pointedly get at that question in the chat, these really were informed by the feedback we've been receiving. So in our community listening sessions, if anyone's interested, our draft recommendations report has an appendix with a summary of all the community engagement. But really a lot of the themes that we heard are echoed here in the guiding principles. And as we're working through updates to the recommendations, we'll be highlighting how some of those may have changed for our commission when we meet with them on September 22nd. Next slide, please. So the recommendations cover broadly community information and engagement, safe evacuation and firefighting response, wildfire risk mitigation requirements for areas of new development, recommendations around recovery planning, and planning for areas subject to natural hazards. And really to get to the possible recommendations, many were raised during the community and stakeholder engagement process, and so we have been going through and continue. It's kind of an iterative process. Go through the recommendations to really elevate recommendations that both align with the guiding principles and also have the highest potential for reducing wildfire risk. This report is being delivered to the legislature, so we really want to elevate what we think are the most important to reduce risk, also that are the most feasible. So what are the needed resources locally? How can these projects or these code updates and other recommendations be implemented? The recommendations range from implementing robust community engagement strategies to providing technical assistance to cities and counties that can increase local capacity, conducting policy research, and establishing regulations through rulemaking by the Land Conservation and Development Commission, or developing voluntary programs. And the recommendations also include a preliminary identification of state and local resources necessary to support the implementation. And as we mentioned before, we're currently engaging with local governments and other partners to further identify and refine the needed resources. And so that is a process we're in right now. And I wanted to note too that in the report, we identify multiple implementation options for several of the recommendations. We want to provide the legislature with some flexibility and a range of choices to achieve the recommendations. And so for 4 out of the 6 recommendations, we have an option A, which is a regulatory approach, and an option B, which is a voluntary approach. So with the regulatory approach, we would look for policy direction, and sidebars from the legislature to guide rulemaking that would be undertaken by the Land Conservation and Development Commission, with a robust community engagement process to define the terms and establish minimum requirements. And option B would be more of a voluntary pathway, again, where standards would be developed through a robust process. And for both of those options, we have listed out a set of tools or resources that we would anticipate being able to offer to local governments to actually get that work done. Yeah, and we would assume that local governments would want or need access to technical assistance, grant funding, and other strategies to support their implementation. All right. That's why it was so short this morning. I missed that whole spiel. So next slide, please. So I'm glad I caught it here. So recommendation 1 is focused on community information and engagement. And as you can see on the screen, recommendation 1 states cities and counties prioritize robust and inclusive community information and engagement in planning efforts to create wildfire adapted communities. So what we're talking about here is any planning activity that a community may undertake that's related to wildfire or hazard planning. Under this recommendation, there would be a requirement or an opportunity voluntarily to develop a robust and inclusive process. So really using best practices and a meaningful participatory process to engage community members, particularly from traditionally underserved and underrepresented communities. And so we're not saying there's a whole new planning process that would have to take place, but rather when you're doing evacuation planning or working on a natural hazard mitigation plan or potentially updating comprehensive plan or development code to address wildfire risk, this recommendation says that you will use a process that's inclusive. And really what we've learned from studies and other research and on the ground work that's happening is that the more inclusive your process is from the start, you certainly will have better feedback, you will engage more people, and you have a higher chance that people will actually work to implement the strategies that come out of that process. Next slide, please. All right, so recommendation 2 and recommendation 3 address safe evacuation and firefighting response. And so with recommendation 2, as it states, cities and counties assess and improve transportation networks for safe evacuation and firefighting response. And so this is really a broad look at an existing transportation network within a community to understand where there may be gaps in the transportation network, where there may be issues with road maintenance that could be upgraded through grants and other opportunities to create better access networks to better improve safe evacuation for residents and visitors, and also to further increase the efficiency of access for firefighting response. And this recommendation really envisions that a community would work, across departments and agencies within the local jurisdiction. So emergency management, transportation, firefighting professionals, as well as across jurisdictional boundaries, because as we know, roads in a community can be controlled by different agencies. So you could have regional planning efforts, you could have state or local roads, county roads, evacuation routes that might cross tribal lands, might cross a reservation, through federal forest. So this would be an opportunity for a community to look broadly at that transportation network. And then it may involve looking at a transportation system plan to see where there might need to be updates in policies. Would there potentially be updates to transportation management, operations and maintenance plans? If deficiencies are identified, then that might involve a capital improvement plan update to identify and prioritize funding for improvements to that transportation infrastructure. Also, it is possible that under this recommendation, when a community is updating its natural hazard mitigation plan, which sometimes is can be a couple cities within a county working together, that's an opportunity to let's see if we can mute Gary. Thank you. Opportunity to look more broadly at evacuation planning through natural hazard mitigation planning lens. And I do want to note that DLCD recognizes that cities and counties may already be engaged in evacuation planning, more at the emergency response and public safety level or through that lens. And this recommendation really is intended to support those efforts through land use and transportation planning. And so we're looking at things like potential evacuation routes and temporary safe zones, areas that might need alternative routes for evacuation, strategies to provide a secondary access where existing development may only have a single access. So is there, shared access agreement or access through a locked gate that could be implemented during an emergency, and other land use and transportation strategies related to the evacuation and emergency response needs. So next slide, please. All right, so recommendation 3, we get a little more into the development process. So recommendation 3, cities and counties review and amend local land use codes to ensure safe evacuation and efficient access for firefighting response. So this is focused on new development. And so cities and counties, again, working with their state and local emergency management and fire protection professionals, would look at existing land division and zoning codes and amend as needed to ensure that those codes require additional street connectivity and site access for new development. It's much harder to retrofit existing development. We're not asking for that, but we're saying, if a new subdivision is coming in, or a large commercial development or a campus, having those access and street connectivity standards in place before development will lead to a development that is more accessible for access for firefighting as well as for safe evacuation. We do understand, and this could apply, as I mentioned, to a subdivision, could be a manufactured home park, a retail center, or other areas with multiple structures, and really looking at things that are in the fire code, so sufficient grade and width for firefighting equipment and personnel being part of that recommendation. And we do understand that there are geography and other factors that might prevent certain locations from complying with this recommendation. And so in our report, we identify that a waiver process should be provided, and that could be a waiver for cities and counties from state requirement, if the case is made that makes sense, or at the local level where a specific development could apply for a waiver. Next slide, please. All right, so recommendation 4 is focused on wildfire risk mitigation requirements for areas of new development. So this is, again, more in the land use and zoning realm. So recommendation 4 reads that cities and counties review and amend comprehensive plan policies and implement land use codes to incorporate wildfire risk mitigation requirements for new development. And this is really focused on areas of greatest wildfire risk, which At the writing of our draft report, the statewide map of wildfire risk had been pulled back, but we are clarifying this in our updated report. But we're really talking about areas of extreme or high wildfire risk, where it's our understanding that using these best practices can really help a community be better adapted and mitigate for wildfire. So we're looking at review and amendment of comprehensive plan policies and land use codes for new development to incorporate requirements and standards to reduce wildfire risk, to ensure provision of services such as adequate water supply and pressure to fight fires, and limiting or conditioning the siting of facilities with concentrated vulnerable populations. So we're talking about schools or hospitals, assisted living facilities, etc., as well as critical facilities, infrastructure and lifelines, and hazardous facilities and materials. And there's a lot of detail for this type of recommendation that would we anticipate, well, we know that they would have to be worked out through a rulemaking process. So we really have not gotten into significant detail, but we have provided several examples in our report that I would encourage people to look at. I'll also note that a waiver process would make sense with this recommendation, so we've identified that. Next slide, please. I will just give a quick overview of the types of mitigation standards for new development or substantially improved buildings that we are contemplating. So we're looking at things like site and design standards. So site and land division approval standards that might look at things like clustering of homes in an area of a lower wildfire risk, while having other parts of that development or a neighborhood serve as a community fire protection break or buffer around the perimeter of a development using open space, natural and built features. And this would be something in addition to defensible space requirements that will be required on individual lots through work that the Office of State Fire Marshal is doing on the statewide defensible space code that is happening now. I also will note that the Department of Consumer and Business Services Building Codes Division is under Senate Bill 762. Also, they're working on an update to the building code for the 1 and 2 family dwelling code for home hardening for new construction. So we have defensible space and increased resilient building codes for individual lots, and then we're looking more broadly at the how those communities are built out. Site and design standards could also use setbacks and home siting standards. We currently have those in forested areas. Those types of standards might make sense to expand into all areas of extreme and high risk. And I mentioned defensible space, which we're not proposing any additional defensible space standards, but just echoing that exists or will exist at the state level through the fire marshal. I'll also note that our recommendations do include some examples around public facilities. So including parks and open spaces. So to look at those plans and policies to ensure that fire breaks and fire mitigation and long-term maintenance are included in, say a parks and open space plan. So we know that these areas are protected and can serve, as parks and open space, but also potentially provide buffers or, not be a source of wildfire fuel. And we're also under public facilities looking more broadly at the community scale, at the provision of services at the community level. So such as water capacity and fire services. So those might be types of considerations that a community would consider when they're looking at areas of new development. And then types of uses I mentioned on the previous slide, but really trying to limit or condition certain types of facilities in areas of extreme and high risk where there might be concentrated vulnerable populations. And so we're concerned about ability to evacuate and for folks to be protected. a condition might be that if that building has to be where it is, and we've heard from, through our stakeholder group and other feedback that, in a rural community, like a school is very important and the center of a community. And if a school needs to be built in a certain place and that's the only, spot in that community, then the school could be built, but there might be some additional requirements in addition to, mitigating wildfire. It could be evacuation planning or other requirements that would make that safer. And then, as I mentioned, also potentially limiting or prohibiting large scale new facilities that use or manufacture or store hazardous combustible materials. We are working on clarifying this recommendation to make it clear that we're not talking about, a farm that has a fuel tank that they use as part of their daily operations. We're really talking about larger scale commercial type facilities. And then I'll note we have another bullet here, density. So really just looking at where there is increased residential density or more intensive uses, really that being a trigger for requiring additional wildfire mitigation. And then lastly, I've mentioned the waiver a couple times, and it's just called out here. So we can really balance the need for development with protection. Next slide, please. All right, so recommendation 5 is focused on recovery planning. And with this recommendation, we're asking for support from the legislature for DLCD to be able to provide support to cities and counties for post-disaster recovery planning in local communities through post-disaster recovery services, I guess, in local communities through recovery planning services. You get the gist of that, but really looking at opportunities for DLCD to support local communities through additional capacity that they might need after a wildfire disaster, any natural disaster for that matter, to process land use or related permit applications, and also engage in broader community recovery efforts. And this is a type of service that DLCD was able to provide to several communities after the 2020 wildfires. We also had our National Flood Insurance Program coordinator who was able to provide support to several cities that had homes that were lost in areas that were designated as floodplains, and there was mapping issues that our department was able to help expedite kind of the process for there's letters of map corrections and other needed resources so folks could get in and rebuild their homes. And I would add to this too, if this is a recommendation that the legislature is supportive of, DLCD would really like to develop more of a programmatic approach to provide this type of recovery, post-disaster recovery planning services. We were able to fund consultants or contract planners to come in and help, but also help communities more broadly do pre-disaster recovery planning before an event happens. And I think there's a lot we can learn from the work that many communities around the state have been doing since the 2020 wildfires. So really pre-planning to reduce barriers can help impacted communities recover more quickly. And I will also note while we're on this slide that our recommendations per Senate Bill 762 really are focused on wildfire mitigation, but recovery professionals and those with lived experience really do recognize that hazards overlap, and that there are a range of hazards in Oregon that we are vulnerable to, and that hazards can reoccur. In conjunction with wildfire, there's increased risk from flooding and landslides post-wildfire. So that's an area where we could offer support and technical assistance. And next slide, please. So the last recommendation is focus more broadly on planning for areas subject to natural hazards. And with this recommendation, DLCD would like to provide additional support to cities, counties, special districts, and tribes to increase the effectiveness of natural hazards planning processes, and the adoption of policies and actions into comprehensive plans and codes, and really looking at how providing additional support for communities that are doing natural hazard mitigation planning. DLCD provides technical assistance, as does the University of Oregon and other organizations. You can help communities with natural hazard mitigation planning, but really looking more closely at how communities who develop community wildfire protection plans, the timing of the development of those community wildfire protection plans to inform an update of a natural hazard mitigation plan, which happens every 5 years, and it's a requirement to access federal emergency management agency funding, and to really look at that process and see if there are opportunities to streamline it, and also to really then take the next step and support communities to integrate wildfire mitigation land use strategies through actionable comprehensive plan policies and implementing codes. And this is something that our natural hazards team that does this work has heard a lot from local governments, that we come in and we have FEMA grant money that we're able to use to help communities go through their natural hazard mitigation plan update, but then the agency can't help beyond that. And communities have said, we would like your help. We'd like a model code. We'd like other support to help us really identify and pull out the most important land use policies and strategies and adopt them directly into our codes. Many natural hazard mitigation plans are appended to a comprehensive plan, but they aren't necessarily looked at in an actionable way. And lastly, this type of effort could allow for better coordination between planning efforts to address, for example, overlapping hazards, which I've mentioned before, assessing needs of socially vulnerable communities, and equitable engagement. And I think I will note that the recommendation and more broadly, these types of recommendations fall under statewide planning goal 7, areas subject to natural hazards, which directs a local government to address natural hazards in their comprehensive land use plan by adopting inventories, policies, and supporting land use codes that are developed through a public planning process. And I will lastly note, as I'm scrolling down on my notes here, that DLCD is currently piloting projects to update the planning processes and integrate updated community wildfire protection plans into natural hazard mitigation plans in Lynn and Benton counties. And so I think we have an opportunity to learn from those projects. And if we have capacity to do that work more broadly, I think that would be very beneficial. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. All right, so we are going to move into community feedback section. Tammy, if you go to the next slide. So we are posing some questions for discussion, but really, if you go to the bottom of the slide, the last bullet point, anything else, anything that you, any ideas or recommendations are welcome. The feedback questions we have, though, is we're interested in hearing any general observations or questions. If you have a major concern, are there additional ideas for implementation activities? So DLCD is very interested in hearing from you about other ideas maybe that they have not thought of or could be built on. There are some examples here on the slide of the types of things that we've heard. And really, are there any potential barriers to implementation? So those of you who have joined us tonight, you are have experience in your local area. So think about what Susan has presented and about barriers. There might be barriers to implementing them. And with that, Tammy, why don't we take the slide down so we can have a discussion here. And I might call on somebody I know. Oh, we have hands up. That's great. Sheila.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, I'm just a citizen, but
Yeah, thank you for joining us.
Well, sure. You mentioned on recommendations, development considerations in areas of high risk. And something that really concerns me is the legislature, allowing new optional uses in areas of high and extreme fire risk, such as the accessory forest dwellings. And yeah, I feel like in Owasco County, it's going to be totally unenforceable. And I'm just really concerned in Mosier, we had a fire a couple of years ago that was started by a relative of a homeowner, and it spread to 1,000 acres, and there's really high winds and steep terrain. It's just really hard once a fire gets started to try to fight it. It's just unreal. But anyway, that was all. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Sheila. Next up is Kim.
Hi, I am a small business owner in rural Washington County, and one of the things that my business, I should say, is an equine facility. And so, of course, that addresses some of the transportation needs, the evacuation stuff. I was a volunteer at the Washington County Fairgrounds in 2020 when we had the fires, and saw a little bit of an issue in the fact that our county was literally one of the last counties that opened up for residences for the other counties who were evacuating, primarily Clackamas County at that point in time, to then open their facilities to have the availability for obviously these huge horse facilities that have 30 to 40 animals. And you're dealing with a whole different segment of a population that most people obviously don't consider, but this is my lifestyle, this is my business, and so I'm going to protect it. And so I volunteered my time down there, but I was very reluctant to see that our county and some of the commissioners were hesitant to do so. So I've scheduled meetings with them. I kind of put some eyes on it. I've talked to the fairground board. I've kind of tried to do what I can to at least get some red flags flying, because my concern obviously is with the fact that I saw many other counties hours ahead of time, if not 12 hours ahead of time, opening up to allow citizens to come in. And here we were as Washington County, as one of the biggest, hugest, agricultural counties that we have. And I was kind of a little devastated to see that had kind of gone under the radar. And so that is kind of my concern going forward, is making sure that the counties are really looking at each of the different populations, like you had said beforehand, to make sure that there are some, underserved, maybe under-realized communities that are being affected with this. And, moving 60 head of horse, just like probably if there were to be a fire in Tillamook, trying to figure out what you do with 200 cattle, like it's something that doesn't always get thought about. And so for me, as this being my business, I'm just trying to advocate for myself and for all of the other people in my community. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, and I would thank you for that, Kim. And in some of the, we had the earlier question about, feedback and how that's been incorporated in the recommendations. We actually had conversations when we're talking about safe evacuation and firefighting response, and having stage areas or areas of temporary refuge, and having heard some of that feedback, like, are there places where along the way of an evacuation route, someone, pulling a livestock trailer can pull over to check, that the lights are working, or really trying to think in advance about some of these issues? And I would hope with that recommendation as well, with kind of a community-wide or regional evacuation and transportation planning type of effort, that those types of considerations about receiving areas and where people go when they have to evacuate could be located. That's a little outside of the land use purview, but our hope is that kind of tying that conversation to land use and transportation can open up a broader conversation related to evacuation planning. So we appreciate your comments.
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just chime in, Susan, over the last couple of days in the broader community listening sessions, where we're kind of like, looking at a broad swath, we've heard a lot about evacuation and shelter needs. Shelter needs have come up in a lot of our conversations, and the differing shelter needs that different populations have. So it's a very timely comment. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Damien? Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening. Let me turn off my hand. Is now a good time to give you some feedback on some of the recommendations with some more specific comments?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
So with respect to recommendations 2 and 3 regarding safe evacuation and firefighting response, this is an area where I think local governments would need likely some rulemaking direction, best practices, technical guidance, but also say funding, especially as we are doing the work right now to implement the new climate-friendly and equitable communities rules. And it's not going to be too far in the distant future that we'll be cracking open the TSPs to update the rules, update our TSPs to address climate change. Regarding recommendation 4, and this is something I think I've shared with some of the staff at the department. As a city, we're required under Goal 11 to have a public facility plan for water that needs to address not only domestic water supply, but also fire suppression. Right now, there's no concurrent requirement for private water utilities in Oregon. And this is an area I wanted to bring to the team's attention because we have a private water utility that serves very large areas outside of Bend to the east and south that under our, I think 2016 or 2011 Community Wildfire Protection Plan, we're in high-risk areas. So they serve, rural subdivisions. They serve areas inside the Bend UGB where they just don't have fire hydrants, or if they do have fire hydrants, they don't have adequate pressure. So what I'm asking politely and respectfully is for any kind of assistance you can provide to help influence the improvements of this infrastructure that is maintained by private water utilities, so that we don't face a situation where we have firefighting equipment trying to hook up to a hydrant near the edge of town and they've got nothing to work with. Also related to recommendation 4, and this is going to sound tongue-in-cheek, but I do mean it as a serious question. I'm curious if you've heard anything from school districts, because in our community, our district has in the past looked for new school sites outside but just adjacent to the UGB in areas that are considered, or probably will be considered, either high or very high fire risk. And this may be a good opportunity for them to think a little bit more carefully about looking at sites beyond just, we have a willing landowner willing to sell and at a price we can afford, especially if it's in an area of high fire risk. And then finally, on recommendation 6, I really appreciate what you're proposing. I think it's this is an area where it's critical to really integrate what we need to do under Goal 7 regarding natural hazards, but also coordinating and integrating the work on community wildfire protection plans and natural hazard mitigation plans. And this is an area where also I'll put in a plug for funding for project implementation, because we do have a recently updated natural hazards mitigation plan for Deschutes County that includes an addendum for the city of Bend. We're trying to find an emergency services manager to help shepherd this to the next round of updates, but also somebody who could help look for grant funding for projects. Thank you.
That's
Thank you.
great.
That's-
Thank you, Damien. Yeah.
Yep, thank you. Commissioner Roberts?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for the time to meet with us and for the welcome from Commissioner Warren. I appreciate that. We kind of in Jackson County, we're the spearhead, I suppose, in the Alameda fire of 2020. And we refer to them as 2020 wildfires, but as far as I know, these fires were arson. They're still under investigation. Kind of a big difference between that and wildfires, even though they burn the same, I suppose. But, and I believe our board passed our letter of comments and sent them in today. So, and so I'm just speaking of personal concerns, I guess, speaking for myself, not my board. And one is the fact that the recommendations I believe that you are presenting tonight are based upon the mapping, the wildfire risk mapping, which has been pulled. So it's very hard to comment on implementation based on a map we don't have anymore. I don't know if the same map will be released, but it sure is challenging in applying what our citizens in their private property may be looking at and applying your recommendations to that. I'm delighted that you feel you have had multiple opportunities for involvement and listening sessions and a survey and stakeholder groups. I will tell you, our local government was not included, nor do I feel like our constituents have been felt included at all. Maybe even a little bit threatened by what's coming down from Salem, whether it's buying or selling property, or even be able to keep their property with insurance concerns. And even we've had multiple citizen led meetings. And I just, because people don't have the answers, and we sure don't have them yet because the risk mapping isn't there, but they're holding their own meetings. And I think that's really unproductive, maybe even counterproductive to rolling out anything. And I know once we get the risk map, our boards talked about trying to hold some public meetings for our citizens because we feel pretty left out down here. I'm glad you asked if we want it voluntary or mandatory. And I think, in my opinion, when it comes to personal property, it should definitely be voluntary. I do not support the mandatory. And yet your recommendations 1 through 4 say it's requirements, and that doesn't have voluntary written in there anywhere. But anyway, we have a lot of concerns, probably more concerns than we have answers. And so that's why I'm tuning in as much as possible so I can get as many answers as I can get till more gets rolled out. But it's rolling out pretty fast when you need to have comments to the legislature by October 1st, and we don't even have a map. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Roberts. And I'll try and address a couple things you said. And then if Sadie wants to weigh in, or Commissioner Warren, that would be great. In terms of the voluntary versus regulatory, we do talk about requirements kind of in the recommendations. And what we mean by voluntary is that if a community wants to adopt requirements locally, they're welcome to do that. DLCDs, if the legislature says go the voluntary route. So we would say, here's kind of a minimum set of standards. If you would like to adopt these, they would be requirements in the local land use code, and policies in the comprehensive plan as kind of detailed in the recommendations, but it wouldn't be the state saying you shall do these things. It would be communities that would like to increase, wildfire mitigation opportunities in their community. They would adopt those locally. So it would be a local process to adopt requirements. And there would be kind of a baseline that would be established by DLCD, not through rulemaking, but through a similar type of engagement process where we can get, feedback from around the state. But again, you'd be opting into that program. And then communities that do opt in, then they would be able to access, additional technical assistance and technical resources and grants and things like that. Regarding the risk map, it is very challenging for us to be writing the recommendations without having the map. And so just to clarify, and we will look at the timeline at the end, our recommendations are going forward to the legislature. They will discuss them generally or specifically, through next year, through 2023, till June, possibly, and then come back to the agency and say, you should go forth and do this work or do that work, and they'll help prioritize and give us some kind of side rails. And then, at that point, we're hopeful there's a map that we can be a little more specific in terms of if we are in rulemaking, really be able to dial into what the actual on the ground implementation looks like. So it's the timeline is definitely challenging, and it's been hard to talk about various types of recommendations without being able to look at a map and understand. We were unable to really even look at how many cities would potentially be impacted that have high and extreme risk area, or how many counties. So it's hard for us to understand the scale and what the needed resources are. So we're working within similar constraints. But I appreciate that feedback for sure.
And I would say it may bring you some comfort, Commissioner Roberts, to know that we did have 4 members of our stakeholder advisory group from Jackson County. Tanner Farrington, Deputy Fire Marshal for Medford Fire Department, Samantha Bear, excuse me, from the Home Builders Association, John Lagarza from Healthy Sustainable Communities, Charisse Sidoriak, and then actually Devin Kessner was representing both Jackson and Josephine counties for land use. He's a land use program manager for Rogue Advocates. So it's very hard to engage people in these processes and get people to spend their evenings in public meetings. So thank you for being here. But we did work very hard to get voices from around the state involved in developing these recommendations, but appreciate the concern, and it's something we'll continue to work on if we move forward with this work after the legislative session.
And no doubt you had stakeholders from Southern Oregon. You did not have local governments, local elected officials. We are elected to protect and represent our citizens, and they had none. So it's kind of concerning, but thank you.
I'd like to open the floor for other comments, questions. It's very helpful for DLCD. Anything that anyone can share at all is. Damien, I see your hands up. Thank you.
I wanted to follow up on the wildfire mapping question, just to really find out if you've heard any kind of update from the Department of Forestry about when a revised or modified version of the map may be available online.
That's an excellent question, Damien, and I don't have an answer, unfortunately. We hope to get some more information in the coming month. I do know that they really, their timeline to get the map out, it was part of the issue with the rollout, and really they want to be able to have enough time to work with people in local communities to really get a better sense of where there maybe are anomalies with the mapping, and also really do, I think I can say this, a better job with communication and education about what the risk map means, and how it really is talking about, an area that's at extreme or high risk, and it's not necessarily, the risk of a specific house burning down, and really do a better job talking about how the risk map is intended to be used under Senate Bill 762. So I think I can say that, but I don't know otherwise when it'll become available.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Trish, I was wondering if you can put, Susan, if there are no other comments, anything at all, I would be wonderful. But if there are no more questions or comments, Susan, I think we can go on to next steps. And Trish, I was wondering if you can put Susan's contact information in the chat, because we are encouraging people, if there's something, both through a public comment form, and also if you have questions for Susan from tonight's presentation, please reach out. Please reach out to her. All right, Susan.
Great, thank you, Libby. Excuse me, next slide, please. So next steps, we get a little bit of the history of where we've been through this process, and it's been a pretty quick, I don't know, 6 to 8 months here to get between January to September. But as mentioned, we've had a stakeholder group meeting, we've had virtual community listening sessions, we've been checking in with the Land Conservation and Development Commission. and tribal consultation. We're currently working on or we have out there the local government survey to look at needed resources, and working with, the League of Cities and the Association of Oregon Counties, the Association of County Planning Directors, and other stakeholder groups, home builders, property owners, to really continue to receive feedback as we refine the recommendations, and input tonight as well, certainly. And we are bringing an update to the commission on September 22nd. And so there's an opportunity if folks are interested and you haven't had a chance to dive into the recommendations report and you want to do that before the 22nd, you can appear either virtually or in person. We'll be in John Day. I don't think we have folks from Eastern Oregon here tonight. We had some this morning, but you're welcome to come in person or comment virtually through Zoom to the commission and share your feedback. And then that wraps up and goes into the report. We are also touching base with the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council at their September 26th meeting to get some feedback, and then putting together the final report by October 1st to deliver to the legislature and the council. We can go to the next slide, please. And here's a kind of a list overview of where we are. I think I just comment on everything. Let's see, recommendations. Yes, let's see. I see your comment, Commissioner Roberts. So yes, if you haven't been receiving information, I would also note that information that we send out, we also send out through our regional representatives who have an extensive list of local contacts. They've been sharing information, and really the best way to receive information is to sign up for our project notice through GovDelivery, and I might ask Sadie to drop that link in the chat. That's also on our website, but that when we have upcoming meetings, when the draft report was released, we have provided notice on GovDelivery, and our commission meetings are also noticed there. So that's for Wildfire, and if you want to make sure you're up to date on the commission meetings, there's a separate box to check. I'm trying to think. Yeah, so next slide, please. So what happens after October? We, as I've mentioned, our report is going to the legislature, and so there will be an opportunity for the legislature. There are various committees. I don't know exactly who will be discussing the report yet, but they will be discussing it, and hopefully they certainly will take feedback from constituents during their public hearing processes, and we hope to receive direction by the end of the session that will help us determine our next steps. And if we are directed by the legislature to enter into rulemaking for any of the recommendations, or if we're looking at voluntary programs, we will then, and throughout this process, be updating and receiving direction from the Land Conservation and Development Commission. So a lot of orange stars. Don't know those meeting dates yet, but those will get scheduled out, really to shape up rulemaking, which is undertaken under the auspices of the commission. And then a rulemaking process would have a robust stakeholder engagement and community outreach process to continue to receive feedback as recommendations are refined. And next slide, please. All right, and here are some of the links that have been shared. The public comment form, so that's really for general comments about the recommendations. If there's things missing or if there are areas of concern, that is a great way to provide that comment. They also can be emailed to me directly. That's fine, and I'll make sure it's all, I'm collating it all as we consider updates. And as mentioned as well, we have a survey for local governments that's out right now to really get a better handle on needed local resources to actually implement this work. Because we know that different communities have different levels of capacity and staffing and expertise. And so, consultants or other resources, model codes really will be important. And we need to have a better understanding of where different communities are at in their work and what types of resources can support implementation. Next slide, please. There we go. All right, so I want to say thank you to everyone for being here. We really do appreciate your time this evening. Hopefully you can get outside before the sun sets where you are. And just want to reiterate that please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or concerns or need additional information. So,
Right, Commissioner Warren, would you like any closing remarks?
No, I think you all did a great job of covering it. And just another thank you to everyone being here this evening. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, with that, we can adjourn. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
good night.